Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our latest Department of Defense Information Analysis Center webinar titled Energy Security. My name is Steve Redifer, and I'm the director of the HDIAC, and today we have the privilege of hosting Ambassador Rich Kozlerich for this presentation. I want to express my sincere appreciation to all of you for taking time out to join us today for this exciting and very relevant and timely topic. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, the Defense Technical Information Center. The DTIC-IAC mission is to collect, synthesize, produce, and disseminate scientific and technical information to the DoD and federal government users. If you've not checked out DTIC's website at www.discoverdtic.mil, take a moment to review their expansive services. Without DTIC sponsorship, this webinar series would not be possible. So a few admin notes, as is typical with these things as we start out. Please note that all the attendee lines have been muted. And if you have questions during the webinar, we're going to ask you to submit them using the attendee chat box you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. And we're going to work to save the last 10 minutes to show the presentation to go over those questions and discuss them to the best of our ability. I'd ask you to please note that this webinar is also being recorded, and we're going to provide you a link for the recording as well as a way to download the slides at the HDIAC website for your later viewing. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's presenter, Ambassador Rich Kozlerich. Ambassador Kozlerich is a distinguished visiting professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University and an HDIAC subject matter expert. In this latter role, he has contributed a number of podcasts and worked as a facilitator for the Smart Bay Smart City workshop we hosted with CSIAC last summer. Prior to joining the Mason faculty, Rich had a distinguished 32-year career in the Department of State Foreign Service, where he served as United States Ambassador to Azerbaijan from 1994 to 1997, and as the U.S. Ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina from 1997 to 1999. Prior to these ambassadorial tours, Rich served as the Senior Deputy to the Secretary of State and the President's Special Representative to the newly independent states. He also worked as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European Affairs, where he was responsible for relations with the former Soviet Union, as well as economic ties with the European Union. In addition to these assignments, Rich has served overseas numerous times, in particular at the U.S. embassies in Ethiopia, Israel, and Togo. In his tenure at George Mason University, Ambassador Kozlerich has been co-director of the Center for Energy Science and Policy, Deputy Director, Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, and Director of the Peace Operations Program. Ambassador Kozlerich currently teaches courses on the geopolitics of energy security and policy communication for executive leadership at the Schar School of Policy and Government. And we are very fortunate to have him sharing his experience with us today for this webinar. So with that, Rich, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, Steve, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure, and I thank you and your colleagues at HDIAC for giving me this opportunity. You know, we always like to think the issues were most important to us are most important to everyone, but I think in this case it actually is true that energy security for people who are working in the national security environment is terribly important. And I hope that through this discussion today, and I hope through the questions that come later, that we can have a good exchange to advance our own understanding of how these issues intersect. Steve's given you already an introduction of me. I want to, through most of this webinar, talk about the methodology for looking at energy security and national security and focusing on geopolitics in particular. Say a couple of words about what's happened in the past year, and then talk about some things that are going to define energy security for the future. Steve's described my background. I would just add that I did spend over 7 years at the National Intelligence Council in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence as the Senior Intelligence Officer on Europe, which added to my understanding of not just energy, but national security issues as well. So this diplomatic and intelligence background has shaped how I approach this topic. And I tend to see energy security very much in an analytical way. I'm a fact-based practitioner. I'm not an academic. I also see energy security as very much being a transdisciplinary issue, and one that very quickly goes into areas that are beyond my professional competence. And so I've come to respect people who are involved in energy science and engineering, business development as very important to adding to my knowledge. And like everything in life, it's more than just describing what's going on. It is about so what? Why is this important, and what does this mean? Like I say, I'm a practitioner, not an academic. I see U.S. energy policy objectives in a geopolitical setting, and I also see U.S. energy security objectives involving the private sector, markets, and private sector behavior. We'll talk a little bit about China's Belt and Road Initiative, and not as much as I would like, given the time available, to talk about Russia, Saudi Arabia, and OPEC. But to look at this national security aspect in the broadest sense of the word, both national security in an external sense, but also in a domestic sense, and how this affects infrastructure, both physical infrastructure and virtual infrastructure, and how do you sustain and make that infrastructure resilient, both to natural as well as man-made threats. Look, our strategic energy interests as our national security interests change. The global economic landscape is in a state of flux. And so when we try to look ahead in terms of international energy, we see a situation that is unclear to say the least. But one thing that is clear to me is that we're at a point where we need a new approach to analysis that can address these sustainability and resilience issues, which are going to be increasingly important as our energy system transitions from a focus on molecules, that is on oil and gas, to one that focuses on electrons, electricity in particular, the role that technology plays in that. And so we really do need to think of our energy systems as hybrid systems, systems that have a fossil fuel basis, a renewable basis, a nuclear basis as we go forward. And that just makes this issue all the more fun because of the complexity here. I'm a great fan of Charlie Munger. Maybe people in the audience know Charlie as Warren Buffett's sidekick, but Charlie has a really great grasp of the importance of models for shaping people making business decisions or analyzing problems like energy security. And Charlie says you really need models that show the relatedness and the effects of relatedness of the various issues in the environment that you're concerned about. And diplomats aren't very good at that. I dare say people in the defense establishment aren't necessarily good at it either. We get in our silos and we tend to stay there. But Munger quoted the biologist Julian Huxley, who said life is just one damn relatedness after another. And I think that really describes the environment that we're dealing in here. My approach to this as both a teacher and a learner is yes, data and information are important. We need to know where to find it, but we also need to know how to integrate knowledge, wisdom, and expertise that comes from different disciplines into a more prescriptive analysis. Second thing, ignorance isn't a bad thing. It's regular behavior. It's not deviant behavior. We need to know where we're ignorant if we're going to be doing good analysis. And we also need to do a much better job of second-order thinking. This is Munger's point. Think of interactions of time and systems development, and that's where the multidisciplinary approach comes forward. And here, I think, is the biggest problem, and that I hope you'll understand why I'm taking the approach that I am taking for the rest of this presentation. we don't step back enough, and I put myself in that we category, to look at the information we consume and ask ourselves, is this going to stand the test of time? Um, the problem of policymakers, analysts, and the public at large when looking at the energy issues, there's just too darn much information. And it all comes to us across a screen, whether it's our phone or our computer. We look at things in the Twitter feed and see how many likes and shares and retweets there are, and we read that and we think we're following a thought leader because it all seems so easy. They've done it in 140 or 260 characters, whatever the max is on Twitter now. But really, what they've done is to really confuse us because we misinterpret what we see in these very simplistic situations, and it's always changing. That we misinterpret not only what we see, but the feedback that we receive in social media. So what I want to do today is to look at some things that I don't think change, and it's important to understand those because that really goes to the heart of the policy environment. And let's start with a term that I think most of us intuitively kind of understand: geopolitics. It's a 19th century idea. It's been refitted for the 21st century, and really is kind of weathered the time from then till now quite effectively. And the person who's really behind this whole idea is Sir Halford John Mackinder, who was a British geographer. Wonderful life span to have been born at the very end of the 19th century and live until the immediate post-World War II period. I mean, I'm reading a book about the Marshall Plan, and I came across a reference to Mackinder, and the author pointed out that Mackinder died the day before President Truman announced the Marshall Plan, which totally changed the U.S. national security involvement into in the world as a whole. So Mackinder is out there as someone who took the world's attention and forced him to look at the world as it looks on a map. He was a Victorian in every sense of that word. His mindset grew out of the British Empire and Imperial thinking, both from a national security point of view and otherwise. As I said, as a geographer, he looked at the world in terms of maps, and his ideas were quite disruptive. And the kind of seminal or starting point, if you want to think in these terms, of Mackinder's writing was an article that appeared in the Geographical Journal in 1904 called "The Geographic Pivot of History." This here is kind of an image of that, where he began to pay attention to what he called the pivot area, this geographic area in what we call Eurasia now, but also included Africa, Europe, and Asia, and out beyond that were outer elements in the world, but the really important action, both from a national security point of view and otherwise, was going to be in that pivot area. Before Mackinder came on the scene and sort of moved the focus to the Eurasian landmass, British imperial strategy, and sorry, I'm practicing national security without a license here, but British imperial strategy was based on control of the seas, a strong navy. Suez Canal became critically important in providing the link between the homeland in the UK and the empire, particularly India. And it was supported by a whole series of coaling stations, infrastructure and supply chain that allowed the Royal Navy to move quickly to deal with threats within the empire. And coal was the fuel of focus. I mean, that kind of drove how the British Empire constructed its presence. And there's an interesting article that I have here that I think is worth people who really are into this sort of thing, worth reading. But it was also built around a dominant naval technology. So the Imperial strategy was focused on the sea, and Mackinder comes along and says, "Hey, here's land surface is really where the action is, and it's this world island of the interconnected continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the development of railroads as the technology of the land island that's really critical. This heartland that basically stretches from the Volga River to the Yangtze and from the Himalayas to the Arctic was a heartland that then at least was ruled by the Russian Empire and later what became the Soviet Union, again within Mackinder's lifetime. His thinking evolved on this, and as I say, this period of his life was absolutely critical to shaping our ideas of geopolitics. But his thinking evolved as well, and so that he in 1919, after World War I and the tragedy that created, he shaped his opinion to focus now on East Europe, and said whoever controls East Europe will control the heartland, and control of the heartland will mean that world island is under the dominating power's control, and whoever controls that will control the world. Pretty explicit in formulation and impact. But Mackinder had, in addition to being a geographer, he just had this great sense of history, particularly the historical sweep of mobility, both on land and sea, and he saw the role that sea mobility played up to his intervention in this discussion. Kind of curious. He also foresaw winged mobility as being significant, though I don't think he was predicting the way the winged mobility would influence the world of national security after World War II in particular. But his focus was on technology that related to the railways, and his expectation, again back to 1904 when he started writing about this, that all of Asia would be covered by railways before long, and Russia would be the center of that in terms of modern railway mobility. He did not anticipate the political changes that would take place in Russia, nor did he anticipate the role of China that we see today, except for kind of a throwaway line that if the Chinese were organized by the Japanese to overthrow the Russian Empire, then they might play that role of being the major power in the world landmass there. So this idea that Mackinder established and was developed through World War I and World War II got into the hands of people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who saw this pivot area, not so much with a European focus, but with a Middle East and Asian focus. And his idea that U.S. national security policy ought to be riveted on this pivot area that really was built around Iran and the other oil-producing countries in the Middle East, and began to include China and India as geographic actors. But from Mackinder's time on through Brzezinski's time, the geopolitics really focused on the movement of oil. Coal may have started this, but oil was what dominated the thinking of geopolitics through the 20th century. And this is just a map that the Energy Information Agency produced to show that for the modern Mackinders, you look at choke points like the Strait of Hormuz and the Malacca Strait and the Suez Canal and the Cape of Good Hope as determining what national security priorities are and what energy security priorities are in particular. So China comes along with their Belt and Road Initiative, and now we've got Mackinder in the 21st century, in a way going back to where he started, that there is a land element to this geopolitical construct. And for China, their Belt and Road Initiative not only is about dealing with choke points by sea, but also providing alternatives to move their goods and services from China to Central Asia and Europe and beyond. So what's new over Mackinder? Well, what's new is the ICC, as he referred to it in his map making. In addition to the Chinese dimension, the possibility of Northeast passages because of the Arctic ice melt now add another dimension to this security. One thing that I think is really important to look at in all of this is what is going to be the impact of renewable energy as we look at geopolitics in the 21st century. It will impact global politics and state power. It adds another dimension from the point of view of supply chains. Mackinder upended the importance of coal and the supply chains provided for that. What we have now in the 21st century is the beginning, I will emphasize the very beginning, of shifting of the supply chain focus from fossil fuels now to renewables. And what does that mean? Maybe we're not talking about an OPEC led by Saudi Arabia for oil, but maybe there'll be an OPEC that will develop for producers of cobalt, rare earths, and other minerals that are so important in developing solar power, batteries, and other aspects of renewable energy. Not just control of the raw materials, but control of the process materials that go into that. And the impact of new technology and new financing mechanisms in the area of renewable energy that come about at the expense of the, if you will, the traditional geopolitics of fossil fuel based energy. Electricity becomes even more important in this new world of renewable energy geopolitics. Whether we're talking about supergrids that allow the cross-border trade in electricity, such as we're seeing in the Baltic area and some parts of Asia, or microgrids that are emerging in Africa and elsewhere. Both trends are vulnerable to cyber attack, and this is particularly an important issue as we enter this era of perpetual cyber conflict. Excuse me. Renewables will mean a reduced demand, not an elimination, a reduced demand for oil and gas. Good news for people who import oil and gas, bad news for countries that export it. And it leads to a whole new question of how do you access renewable energy in a way that's sustainable and sustains development. And here's where ignorance comes back in. The bottom line in all of this, and this is from Megan O'Sullivan, a Harvard scholar who writes a lot about renewable energy and particularly the geopolitics, is that ideally a global energy system that's dominated by renewable energy should be more stable and peaceful, compared to one that's dominated by fossil fuels and nuclear. But what she admits is what we all need to admit, is that we do not know, we are ignorant about the geopolitical path toward this end state. What about the geoeconomics of all of this? This is really where we get into the Belt and Road Initiative, because there's an energy component, there's a trade component. And it's not a coherent system. It's a series of systems that reflect Chinese economic interests in regions on their border, as well as the idea of a land bridge corridor to Europe from Eurasia. The seaborne dimension of this is still critical because a lot of the land initiatives are meant to overcome some of the bottlenecks, choke points that we talked about earlier. But this is unlike Mackinder's, which certainly had an economic element driving it. Mackinder was more focused on pure geopolitical national security impacts. The Chinese have an economic dimension. And that's what makes their approach here a little different. So it's really important to begin talking about geoeconomics, particularly as we relate that Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese to megatrends that are underway that further define geoeconomics, demographic and social change, the shift of the global economy from the West to Asia and China in particular, rapid urbanization, which is accenting the demand for electricity, climate change and resource scarcity issues and technological breakthroughs, all of which come together and create these geoeconomic features of super competitive cities, of food integrity and transparency, and of increasingly connected living. Back in 2016, the National Intelligence Council prepared an analysis of national security threats that are arising in this area of megatrends. I don't want to go over all of these in detail, but I do want to mention a couple. One, the impact of extreme weather events on defense infrastructure and the economic consequences, as well as the security consequences of that. The potential for interstate conflicts over water and food, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But particularly that it's important to look at the increasingly decentralized power grids and the vulnerabilities to cyber attack that are being introduced to those. The consequences of this, again, the threat to stability of countries, especially when you get involved in these water disputes. Migration because of social and political tensions. Adverse effects on food prices and availability. Increased risks to human health. The pandemic is perhaps the most important one. And then the stress on military operations and basing that the Arctic melt is introducing. So the geoeconomics of this is really broader than just trade and investment. It's the economic consequences of climate-induced changes that are affecting energy in particular. And just kind of a micro example of what I'm talking about here. This map shows the Nile River Basin, and Ethiopia is in the middle of building a dam called the New Renaissance Dam project. It's a huge project designed to alleviate electricity shortages in Ethiopia, to do it with clean energy, hydropower, all to the good for Ethiopia. But at the same time, without consulting with neighbors downstream in Sudan and Egypt, they are creating the possibility of not just tensions, but maybe outright war in this region over water that's being diverted or changed in terms of its flow because of this hydroelectric project. So geoeconomics really play a huge role in, along with the traditional geopolitics of the map of the region, like you see here. Finally, geotechnology. Here, I think the real geotechnological power in the world today is the United States. I mean, we are really benefiting from the non-conventional, the fracking technology that George Mitchell, a petroleum engineer from decades ago, actually came up with, and he had really ambitious goals for using this technology to reach energy resources that would help the United States grow and prosper. But as Megan O'Sullivan points out, he really didn't understand how this unconventional oil boom, and I will put gas in along with that, helped launch even bigger and more widespread impacts, and how it altered the geopolitics, because it wasn't just simply a case of choke points located in regions nearby oil and gas producing areas, such as the Middle East and Hormuz, or the Black Sea and the Dardanelles for Russia. It really altered geopolitics in a way that allowed the United States to become a major oil and gas producer in a way that wasn't even imaginable 5-10 years ago. And so technology can play that kind of role in making countries as large as the United States, but maybe as small as countries like Israel, very much factors in geoeconomics, geopolitics, and, as I said, geotechnology. And this is not just limited to fracking, to non-conventional oil and gas development. We've seen the price of wind and solar power, renewable power, go down. The technological changes in battery storage have increased the possibility of dealing with interruptions in renewable energy supply and helping integrate those into electrical grids. Seen tremendous efficiency gains, both in the production and consumption of energy. The potential to move nuclear from an unacceptable category for many people in the public to an acceptable one via small modular reactors. And I think most important, and really important to follow in the next 5 years, is whether carbon capture, storage, and sequestration technology becomes commercially feasible and allows us to really think about decarbonizing, removing carbon that is put into the atmosphere by the production and consumption of energy. It may, in fact, carry with it the possibility of saving coal as a source of energy production. Black swans worth thinking about are hydrogen. We hear a lot about that in the media today, but don't be deceived by the latest tweet about hydrogen. You'll find one every 10 minutes, at least I do. And then the last point about technological change is a negative one, that the increased involvement of energy systems in both artificial intelligence as well as cyber have increased the vulnerabilities of energy grids that I think raise a set of sustainability and resilience issues that really have to be addressed, because the more hybrid your energy system becomes, the greater the vulnerability to cyber attacks. And we really have to find new ways of coordinating between government and private sector interests, because private sector sees trade-offs between efficiency and security that those of us who have operated in the national security space don't see those trade-offs. And we need to make sure we're evaluating risk in the same fashion. That doesn't seem to be taking place today, and that we adjust our focus on the supply chain, both inside and outside of government, from looking at the perimeter protection, the old guns, gates, and guards analogy, and look at a multilateral approach, and deal with the question of what's the appropriate backup for that system. What I'm trying to point out here with this technology point that takes us quite a ways away from where I started is that technology is going to shape at least the vision for the future. The idea of a secure, low carbon energy system is a long-term process. Whatever politicians are telling you, this is going to be decades in the making. And the policies that are going to have to be put into place must be effective and politically feasible. We need to emphasize the production, delivery, and consumption of energy that provides for diversity of energy sources at the same time, not releasing harmful greenhouse gases, and connected with that, alleviates geopolitical tensions that have been associated, as Megan O'Sullivan pointed out, with competition for fossil fuel. What this does for the U.S. role as in energy self-sufficiency, positive or negative, I do not know. But clearly the technology is going to drive the integration of both energy security and climate change priorities. And buried in this is how do we assist energy producing countries now that depend on oil and gas for their livelihood and stability, transition to this new low carbon future where their energy resources will not be in great demand. As I think about technology, I'm reminded of Archimedes' statement of millennia ago. Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I can move the world. Well, it's kind of that way, I think, in the energy area as well. The technology concepts are out there and available. They may not be available commercially at scale yet, but they are available. But it takes money and it takes time. And so we can talk about batteries, making renewable energy the basis for our electrical power system, but where's the investment going to come from, and how much time are you going to give me? Can we do this by 2050, the way the Europeans are talking about it? Or what about hydrogen, the flavor of the month? Hydrogen replacing natural gas, green hydrogen as opposed to blue hydrogen. Great idea, seems to work. How much time do I have, and where's the money going to come from? These are the basic fundamental questions that play into this geotechnological world that we're seeing. So just a kind of a word about disruptions in 2020. What I've talked about up to this point was, would have been, significant, whatever happened last year. But as Fatih Briol, the head of the International Energy Agency, said at the beginning of the coronavirus impact on the global energy demand, 2019 seems like 100 years ago. And so we've had really a fundamental impact of the pandemic on thinking. People who are in the business of evaluating risks in the business community. This chart comes from a study by the Eurasia Group, which is a political risk group in the United States, AXA, which is an insurance company group in Europe, and Ipsos, which is a marketing polling organization that operates globally. But they've looked at the emerging risks, top 10 emerging risks for 2020. They've done this in the past. So number one is pandemics and infectious diseases, which has jumped up seven levels, if you will, among the 10 emerging risks for these political risk specialists. Climate change has dropped down, cybersecurity, geopolitical instability, and social discontent. So that the impact of the coronavirus is really a once in the century event in terms of energy demand. The International Energy Agency is estimated that energy demand dropped 6% in 2020 alone, which is the largest shock to the energy system in 70 years. And what that means is that a lot of what we're talking about is going to be impacted, either the transition process or the reliance on oil and gas for the United States as well as for other countries as well. And it's hard to change things with policies alone, and that's why I think it's important to talk about what I think are 6 marks of energy security today, because an energy system has really built into it a certain sense of inertia, because of the scale and the amount of investment that's gone into the existing system. This really doesn't change easily. As I pointed out, it takes decades for these things to turn around. It's a very large tanker in the middle of the Atlantic that you don't change course on a dime, and it's similar in the area of energy security. For me, the first mark is this chart or slide, excuse me. More people living inside that circle than live outside it. The role of Asia, particularly China and India, both energy security and national security, not to even mention geopolitics, is absolutely critical, and that's not something that's going to change. Another thing that will not change easily is primary energy consumption. Our system is carbon based, and if you look at this slide, the green, red, and gray colors there represent oil, natural gas, and coal in particular. And this is, world consumption overall. It is a carbon based world, and it really hasn't changed that much over the last decade or so. Oil and coal consumption have dropped a bit. One due to increased efficiency of the transportation system that uses a lot of oil, and the substitution of gas for coal in the electrical power system. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. But renewable energy has started from a very, very low base, and even though the slope of the line is in the right direction, the amount of increase in the overall share is not that great. Another way of really looking at this is to break down, world energy demand. All this thanks to BP, by the way. They do the best number crunching around when it comes to this. But if you look at the regional consumption patterns, based on what I just showed you globally, and look at North America on the left and Asia and the Pacific on the right as you see the screen. And you have consumption of oil and gas being quite large compared to other sources of energy, particularly coal. But in Asia and the Pacific, it's coal that really dominates energy consumption. And BP is starting this year is kind of making this shift in its focus as an energy company away from oil and gas and into renewable energy. And so they look out to a changing global energy system, and what would it look like? What kind of change would have to take place between today, 2020, and 2050? What the world that they might want to be would require an increase in renewable energy and a decrease in consumption of carbon-based fuels, which simply isn't going to become a reality by government policy alone, and certainly not by market behavior alone. The focus is our third mark. The focus in the energy market now is on gas. Back in the 90s, it was all oil because we didn't know where the next barrel of oil was going to come from, except the Middle East. And now gas has become the major focus. And why is that? Well, it's because gas is becoming more important as a source of fuel for electricity generation. That's the element of energy that everyone wants to have more of is electricity, and how you get that is really the question. But in the last decade or so, gas has increased. It has resulted in decreased use of coal globally. You can see again the renewables part there increasing to the point where today as much energy comes from renewable sources as is generated by nuclear power, but still far from the amount that would be required to significantly change the mixture here of carbon-based energy. And again, if we look at this picture, go back to our regional approach to this, electrical power generation by fuel. North America, gas is the predominant fuel. Low prices of gas as a result of our non-conventional oil and gas development. It's replaced coal, but not totally. But if you look at Asia and the Pacific on the right, coal is still the major source of electrical power. And think about that. If the demand for electricity is increasing as rapidly as it is, particularly in Asia and India and China being the main drivers here, you're dealing with still a coal-based power system. And that becomes kind of interesting when you break this down a little bit. So coal, which Mackinder had apparently graduated from as he moved through his thinking on geopolitics, and from coal to oil as the major driver of national security interests. Look what's happening around the world. We'll just use a couple of three examples here. We'll look at Germany, we'll look at the U.S., and then India and China. And the Germans, are proud of the shift that the German economy has gone through in terms of reliance on renewables, to the point that almost 35%, I'm convinced it's probably closer to 40% now, of their power production comes from renewable sources, mainly onshore wind and solar. Not so much from natural gas, not so much from nuclear, but still a heavy reliance on coal when you look at the mixture. And why is that? Because they need the base power backup when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And the only short-term recipe to that is for them to maintain coal-fired power plants basically in reserve. But if you kind of look at the U.S. Here, we have a big reliance on natural gas. Petroleum is basically all transportation and industrial base. Coal is only 14%, about the same as renewable energy. And if you look back here at the German example, this is our gas, and the gas powered part is really from other sources in the U.S. Electrical power generating picture. So coal is a decreasing commodity in terms of the energy mix for the U.S., even though renewable energy is not anywhere close to the level that it is in Germany. But natural gas is a much higher component, and that has allowed coal production or coal consumption to decrease. But here's the chart. Go away from this discussion if you think of nothing else. Think of this chart. For India and China, let's say it, 60% of their energy consumption comes from coal. And how do you change that in a short period of time? it's hard. It's not something that even the centralized Chinese system can order into being. And the Chinese have said by 2060 they're going to be a net zero carbon producer. I don't get how they get there when they rely so much on coal, and they haven't figured out a way of growing their electrical power system to meet demands. So the bottom line in all of this, and this is the major mark here, that the share of fuel mix in the generation of power, again, that's that electrical power sector that absorbs more primary energy than any other. There really hasn't been a major shift or improvement, if you want to think about these terms, of the fuels that feed the power sector for the past 20 years. The share of coal is exactly the same as it is in 1998. And why is that? It is, in fact, because of China and India. And I don't come here with a solution to that, but I just want to make sure that those 6 marks are, I don't want to say enduring, but they certainly are going to be very, very hard to change because of the scale, as I said, and the inertia that gets built into an energy system that's built around a particular primary source of energy. We've been lucky in the U.S., I think, because markets have worked. So let me conclude by saying, these interrelationships that I've described, the role of technology that I've described, the importance of China and India, and all of this means, I think, that we really need to be more creative about our concept of energy security. We have historically, and for our geopolitical relations as well, focused on the supply side. How do we assure adequate supplies of oil and gas in order to keep our economy growing? And if we're going to go beyond that, we need to start looking at demand and how that is affected. Because I really don't care if you're sitting in Washington or New Delhi or some rural area in China. These 6 pieces are part of your equation as a consumer of energy. You want an abundant supply. You want a reliable supply that's accessible on demand. You really do want clean energy. Nobody wants a dirty environment either around their homes or a climate that's being impacted by CO2 emissions. Energy has to be affordable. In countries like India, the whole question of social justice, of extending access to rural areas which have no electricity at all at a price they can afford, is a major element of demand for energy. The system and what we want is a resilient system that survives disasters as minor as the latest thunderstorm that goes through the DC area, or as major as a Fukushima, taking out a large section of the Japanese power system in one tsunami. And then we want to be able to have diverse sources. It used to be especially oil, but now I think it's gone beyond that to include gas. And as we look at rare earths and other minerals, we want to make sure that there are diverse sources for that, for the renewable energy part of this as well. So what that means is that we've got an intersection of elements in energy security that go beyond supply. They include transportation and infrastructure. They include environment and climate change. They include demand, and navigating in this space makes it hard to develop ultimately what are going to be the national security challenges that are connected with this. So let me just try very quickly to lay out some things that I think for those of us who are also concerned about national security that we should be watching for in 2021. as I said, I didn't spend the time that I would like to further explore the Russia-Saudi cooperation in OPEC plus. But even with this collapsed energy demand, how oil producers globally are going to respond to that. It's going to be really quite interesting. And the Russian-Saudi relationship is a key part of that. Saudi Arabia is now trying to play a key swing role as a producer, but how long can they maintain the limits, if you will, on energy on oil production? U.S. LNG exports, are they going to go to Asia or Europe? Watch how the Asian energy grid responds to this cold weather that's affected Northern Asia, China, South Korea, and Japan in particular. It certainly has revealed vulnerabilities. Whether those are related to the grid itself or inability to keep up with demand for more electricity is another story, but they should have an impact. And then the impact on the grid of decentralized energy producers being integrated into it in the U.S. and Europe in particular. China and India energy demand overall beyond gas are going to be critical. And then finally, Russian sanctions and EU priorities are also going to affect this. But I think the most significant national security challenge will be in the cyber area and the risk of cyber attacks on the U.S. energy grid. I know that the solar wind issue has gotten a lot of people's attention, but I think we really need to look seriously at what the impact of that will be. So let me stop here, see if there's any time left for questions, and be happy to try to deal with those.
Ambassador, thank you so much for the presentation. You got lots of favorable comments, and I really do appreciate everybody who's been asking questions in the chat back and forth. Very, very grateful for the active participation of our audience. We have about a dozen questions. I think we'll get through 2 or 3 of these, sir, so in the 5 minutes we have left. So let's kick it off. Ms. Serena Goff asks, how is nuclear energy production moving from unacceptable to acceptable? I think she's talking about the recent trend of nuclear plants being decommissioned, the concern after the Fukushima disaster, and now it appears to be coming more into vogue. We have given 2 webinars on small modular nuclear reactors to kind of back up that thesis. So what are your thoughts on that, sir?
Well, that's really an important question because if people are concerned about the environmental impact of producing electrical power, nuclear is an available alternative today. We don't have to wait to develop green hydrogen or some other fancy technology that we haven't even thought about yet. But for nuclear to make a comeback, it's going to be a combination of 2 things. One, the Chinese emphasis on nuclear as a major element in their ability to meet these ambitious targets that they've set for themselves of a net zero carbon energy system by 2060. We may not like to hear that as Americans, but certainly the development of nuclear power in China can have spillover effects that may work to our advantage. I still think small modular reactors are the answer. Question is, can they be available at scale in commercial ways that minimize the proliferation concerns if we're going to use these in countries other than the U.S. But also there has to be more public acceptance of nuclear power in the U.S. than there seems to be today. So I think it's going to be a combination of the right kind of technology, experience in other countries that's positive, and our ability to help the public realize that if you want cleaner power, this is a very important opportunity to follow.
We had 2 somewhat related questions. Jim Iska and Jason Woods are both interested in, we talk about energy security in the U.S. while at the same time trying to reduce carbon emissions, yet developing nations and countries such as China are contributors to the global carbon release. So how do you see the conundrum of worldwide competition, yet bringing third world countries into the first world while simultaneously reducing hydrocarbon emissions in the United States and maintaining competitiveness?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to see what in fact the Biden administration is going to be able to accomplish by making climate change such a high priority issue. I from experience, I know it's not going to be done in the negotiating room in Paris or any place else where diplomats get together and talk about this. It's really going to happen in the global marketplace. Um, and so again, I think markets are going to help determine more than anything the shift away from fossil fuel based energy to no carbon or low carbon based systems. And we're already seeing some of that. Very interesting to read the Financial Times and in the last I would say 3 to 4 months, there have been a series of stories about how financial markets, banks and investment institutions are feeling pressure from the public and from their shareholders to make more investments available in renewable energy. Whether that comes at the expense of carbon-based energy is another story here. But the more money that goes into renewable energy and developing some of these new technologies so that they can be applied at scale, that's where I think the real progress is going to take place. We cannot solve the global problem by ourselves, and the questioners are correct. We've got to find a way to bring India and China along on this because it's not going to work. It's not going to work otherwise. And I'll just add a footnote here. We can't give up on carbon-based energy. Natural gas powered electrical generators, produce far less emissions than do coal-fired generators. And as a transition fuel, I still believe firmly that gas has a role. And there, the U.S. does have an advantage because of our domestic sources of gas production. How long that lasts is another question, but still, I think that the elements are there to make this transition period speed up a bit, but it's still going to be very, very long. And again, it can't happen without China and India.
Well, Rich, thank you very much for that, and we certainly appreciate the questions. We received a wide variety of questions that we didn't get to, but again, thanks everybody, and thanks for joining us today. As mentioned at the beginning of today's webinar, the slides and recording of this presentation will be made available for download at the HDIAC website, www.hdIAC.org. If you're interested in learning more about the IACs or in getting involved as a subject matter expert or presenter, or just expanding your presence in our community, please feel free to reach out directly using the contact information that you're going to see on the left-hand side of the screen. In addition to these monthly webinars, the HDIAC also offers monthly podcasts you can sign up for, bi-weekly email digest, as well as a technical inquiry service with up to 4 free hours of technical consulting from our staff here. And we can perform customer-funded work tailored to any of our technical areas to support you via a pre-competed contract. For those of you interested in alternative energy, you can check out our recent state-of-the-art report on that topic. And our next state-of-the-art report that George Mason has helped us put together is going to focus on critical infrastructure protection, so be on the lookout for that one. And then finally, we had several questions about space solar energy. Check out our webinar from Paul Jaffe at the Naval Research Lab on space power beaming. And then we also had 2 webinars on small modular nuclear reactors, which you heard Rich mention in his brief. Be sure and check those out. And again, that contact information is included in the chat box on the left-hand side of the screen. If you enjoy these products, please like us and follow us on social media.